The year is 1683. Europe is a continent of division. Kings, emperors, they're all vying for power. Religious wars have scarred the land for generations. In the West, great maritime nations look across the oceans building new empires in faraway lands. But, in the East, an old fear is stirring. A different kind of empire is on the move. An empire of immense power and ancient ambition. The Ottoman Empire, a force that has shaped the world for centuries, is once again turning its gaze toward the heart of Europe. This is a story of a clash of civilizations, a tale of two worlds destined to collide at the gates of one city. This was not just a conflict between two armies, it was a struggle for the very soul of Europe. Now, the stakes were impossibly high. For the Ottoman Empire, this was the culmination of a dream of conquest that stretched back for hundreds of years. Capturing Vienna, the Golden Apple, would mean a decisive victory. It would open the door to the rest of the continent. For the defenders of Vienna, and for the scattered kingdoms of Christendom, failure was unthinkable. It meant the potential collapse of their way of life. The fate of Europe hung by a thread. This single battle would decide the course of history for centuries to come. The continent was, well, a tapestry of competing interests. France, under its Sun King, Louis XIV, watched from the sidelines. The French king saw the Holy Roman Emperor as his main rival. A weakened emperor could mean a stronger France. The Protestant states of Northern Europe were wary of Catholic power. They were reluctant to join a holy war. The continent was fractured. It was vulnerable. While European leaders squabbled among themselves, the Ottoman war machine was gathering its strength, preparing for a campaign of unprecedented scale and ferocity, a campaign aimed at the very heart of their ancient enemy. Imagine a world without the Europe we know today. A world where the call to prayer echoes through the Rethine. The Gau Braid, Arde de Gro de Briefer Reet. Het zie down kaken frau vervrodet vriev. Of Germany and Italy, this was the future that hung in the balance. The city of Vienna stood as a bulwark. It was the last major obstacle on the road to Central Europe. For centuries, it had been the front line in the long struggle between the Habsburgs and the Ottomans. Now, it was about to become the epicenter of a conflict that would change the world forever. The story of Vienna in 1683 is more than just a battle. It is the story of a moment when history itself held its breath, waiting for the outcome of one epic siege. The late 17th century was a time of profound anxiety. The memory of the 30 Years' War was still fresh. That brutal conflict had torn Central Europe apart. It had pitted Catholics against Protestants in a struggle that left millions dead. Catholics, Protestants, cities were razed. Famine, plague, the peace that followed was fragile. The Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of hundreds of small states, was politically and militarily exhausted. Its ruler, Emperor Leopold I, was a cautious and deeply religious man. He was not a warrior king. He faced threats from all sides, not least from the ambitious King of France. This internal weakness was well known to outsiders. The Ottoman sultans in Constantinople had watched Europe's self-destruction with keen interest. They saw an opportunity. For them, a divided Christendom was a weak Christendom. They had a long-standing claim to universal empire. Their faith compelled them to extend the domain of Islam. The conquest of Red Apple, their name for the great Christian capitals, was a sacred duty. Rome had fallen centuries ago. Constantinople itself was now their capital. Vienna, the seat of their Habsburg rivals, was the next logical prize. It was the gateway to the soft underbelly of Europe. Across the capitals of Europe, diplomats exchanged hushed warnings. Spies reported on massive military preparations in the Ottoman lands. The scale of the mobilization was staggering. Blacksmiths forged cannons day and night. Shipwrights prepared fleets to sail the Danube. Countless soldiers, from every corner of the vast empire, were being called to arms. Yet, many European leaders were paralyzed by their own rivalries. They hoped the threat would pass. They prayed it was aimed at someone else, perhaps Poland, Russia. Few wanted to commit their own troops and treasure to defend a rival power. This political paralysis created a vacuum. It left the eastern frontiers dangerously exposed. The Habsburg Emperor, Leopold I, had a peace treaty with the Ottomans. It was a fragile truce, signed 20 years earlier. He hoped it would hold. He sent ambassadors to Constantinople to negotiate, to offer concessions. But the mood in the Ottoman capital had changed. A new aggressive leadership was in charge. They were not interested in peace. They were interested in glory. They were interested in conquest. The drums of war were beginning to beat, and their rhythm was felt all the way from the plains of Hungary to the palaces of Vienna. The Ottoman Empire was one of the great powers of the early modern world. It was vast, multi-ethnic, and a formidable military machine. At its height, it stretched from the gates of Vienna in the north to the deserts of Arabia in the south. It controlled North Africa, the Middle East, the Balkans. Its armies were disciplined, well-equipped, and vast in number. The Sultan in Constantinople was not just a king, he was the caliph, the successor to the Prophet Muhammad. He commanded the absolute loyalty of millions. His empire was built on conquest. Its very identity was tied to the idea of continuous expansion. The elite core of the Ottoman army were the Janissaries. These were soldiers taken as boys from Christian families in the Balkans, raised as devout Muslims, and trained for war from a young age. They knew no other life. They were fanatically loyal to the Sultan. They were masters of siege warfare and disciplined infantry tactics. Alongside them fought the Sipahis, the feudal cavalry who provided the army with its mobility. And then there were the vast numbers of irregular troops, the Akinji, Tartars, who raided ahead of the main army, spreading terror and chaos. This was not just an army, it was a society organized for war. For centuries, the Ottoman march into Europe had seemed unstoppable. In 1453, they had conquered Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. This sent shockwaves across Christendom. In the 16th century, under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, their armies had swept through Hungary. They laid siege to Vienna for the first time in 1529. That attempt had failed, but it left a deep psychological scar on the European mind. The Turkish threat became a constant reality. It was a source of fear that shaped politics, religion, and culture for generations. The crescent moon, the symbol of the Ottomans, cast a long shadow over the cross. Now, in 1683, that shadow was growing darker again. The empire was led by a man who dreamed of succeeding where Suleiman had failed. He believed the time was right. Europe was divided. The Habsburgs were weak. He assembled an army larger than any seen in generations. Estimates put its strength at over 150,000 men, perhaps even more. It was a river of steel, men, and horses, flowing out of the east. Its destination was clear: Vienna. The goal was not simply to raid or to plunder. The goal was total conquest. The goal was to extinguish the Habsburg capital and break the will of Christian Europe once and for all. Vienna was more than just a city. It was a symbol. It was the imperial residence of the Holy Roman Emperors of the House of Habsburg. For centuries, this dynasty had been the most powerful in Central Europe. They saw themselves as the defenders of the Catholic faith. Vienna was their crown jewel. It was a center of art, music, culture. Its magnificent palaces, churches, university were the envy of the continent. The city sat at a strategic crossroads. It controlled the Danube River, the great waterway that flowed from the heart of Europe down into the Black Sea. To control Vienna was to control the trade and military routes of the entire region. The city itself was a fortress. It was protected by a complex system of fortifications, star-shaped bastions, tall walls, and deep moats. This style of defense was the cutting edge of military engineering for its time. It was designed to withstand cannon fire. The walls were angled to deflect shots. The bastions allowed defenders to fire down on any attackers trying to approach the base of the walls. In theory, Vienna was a tough nut to crack. It had withstood a siege before, in 1529, but that was over 150 years ago. The art of war had changed. However, the fortifications were old. They were in a state of disrepair. The long years of peace and the emperor's financial troubles meant that maintenance had been neglected. The walls were crumbling in places. The moats were partially filled in. The suburbs of the city had grown and expanded, right up to the edge of the defensive works. These suburbs would provide perfect cover for an attacking army. They would allow enemy sappers, the military engineers who dug tunnels, to approach the walls unseen. The city's defenses were a pale shadow of what they once were. They were an illusion of strength. Inside the walls lived a bustling population of around 100,000 people, merchants, artisans, scholars, nobles. Most had never known war. Their lives were filled with commerce, faith, family. The threat from the east felt distant to many. It was a story told by their grandparents. They trusted in the emperor. They trusted in the city's famous walls. They could not imagine that their comfortable world was about to be turned upside down. They could not imagine that their beautiful city was about to become the stage for one of the most brutal and decisive sieges in the history of the world. The man leading the Ottoman charge was not the Sultan himself. Sultan Mehmed IV was honestly more interested in hunting than in warfare. The real power in the empire lay in the hands of his Grand Vizier. This man was Mirzifonlu Kara Mustafa Pasha. Ambitious, ruthless, supremely confident. He came from a humble background, but had risen through the ranks of the Ottoman state through sheer determination and political skill. He was now the most powerful man in the empire, second only to the Sultan. And he dreamed of a victory that would make his name immortal, a victory that would surpass even the achievements of Suleiman the Magnificent. Kara Mustafa was a devout Muslim, but his primary motivation was ambition. He saw the conquest of Vienna as his personal destiny. It would bring him immense wealth, power, prestige. It would secure his position and silence his rivals at the court in Constantinople. He was a capable administrator, a skilled logistician. Assembling the vast Ottoman army was a testament to his organizational genius, but he was also arrogant. He underestimated his enemies. He believed that the sheer size of his army would guarantee victory. He dismissed the warnings of some of his more experienced commanders. He saw the Habsburg Emperor Leopold I as a weak and indecisive ruler. He knew about the political divisions in Europe. He had made a secret alliance with Hungarian rebels who were fighting against Habsburg rule. He had also secured assurances from King Louis XIV of France that he would not interfere. Everything seemed to be falling into place. Kara Mustafa believed that God had ordained this moment for him. He saw himself as the sword of Islam, destined to deliver a fatal blow to the heart of the infidel world. His confidence was infectious. It spread throughout the ranks of his massive army as they marched west. The Grand Vizier brought with him the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad. This was a holy relic only brought out for the most important campaigns. Its presence signified that this was no ordinary war. This was a jihad, a holy war. For the soldiers in the Ottoman army, this was a chance to win glory in this life and paradise in the next. Kara Mustafa's leadership, combined with this powerful religious fervor, created a sense of unstoppable momentum. The Ottoman war machine, with the ambitious Grand Vizier at its head, seemed like a force of nature, a force that was about to be unleashed upon the unprepared city of Vienna. As the Ottoman army began its long march, a sense of unreality still gripped Vienna. The emperor and his court hoped for a diplomatic solution. They clung to the fragile peace treaty. They sent envoy after envoy to the Ottoman camp, envoy arriving at the Ottoman camp. They offered more tribute, more concessions. They could not believe the Grand Vizier was serious about attacking the imperial capital itself. Surely this was just a show of force, maybe just a negotiating tactic to extract more money from the Habsburg treasury. The ordinary citizens of Vienna went about their daily business. The threat felt far away, a problem for politicians and diplomats. The man in charge of Vienna's defense was Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. He was a veteran soldier, tough and experienced. He knew the city's defenses were weak. He pleaded with the emperor's war council for more men, more money, more cannons. His requests were largely ignored. The imperial treasury was empty. The best troops were stationed elsewhere, guarding against a potential French attack on the Rhine. Starhemberg was left with a small garrison of just over 11,000 professional soldiers. It was a dangerously small number to defend such a large perimeter against the coming horde. As the Ottoman army crossed into Habsburg territory, panic finally began to set in. The horrifying truth dawned on the court. This was not a bluff. This was a full-scale invasion. Emperor Leopold I, not a military man, made a fateful decision. He would not stay and be trapped in the city. On July 7, 1683, just a week before the Ottomans arrived, the emperor and his entire court fled Vienna. They packed their treasures and retreated up the Danube to the safety of Passau. Their departure sent a terrible message to the people of the city. They were being abandoned. The flight of the emperor caused mass panic. Tens of thousands of citizens tried to flee. The roads leading west were choked with carts, wagons, and desperate people. It was a chaotic exodus, but many had to stay behind. The poor, the infirm, and those who simply could not get out in time. They were now trapped. Along with Starhemberg's small garrison, about 5,000 citizen militia members were armed to help defend the walls. They were shopkeepers, bakers, and students, not soldiers. This small, determined group, along with the remaining citizens, now looked east. They watched and waited for the arrival of the largest army on Earth. Their fate now rested in their own hands. In early July, the vanguard of the Ottoman army appeared on the horizon. These were the Tartar horsemen from Crimea. They were the eyes and ears of the main force. They swept across the Austrian countryside like a plague of locusts. They burned villages, slaughtered livestock, and rounded up thousands of civilians to be sold into slavery. Their purpose was to create a zone of terror and devastation around Vienna. This would deny the city's defenders any resources from the surrounding area. It also served to shatter the morale of anyone who might have considered resisting. The smoke from burning farms and hamlets was a visible warning of the horror to come. Behind this screen of terror, the main Ottoman army advanced. It was a city on the move, a seemingly endless column of men, animals, wagons that stretched for miles. The ground shook with the tread of thousands of feet and the rumble of heavy wheels. The army was a spectacle of imperial power. Janissaries in their white hats, Sipahi cavalry with their gleaming lances, engineers from every corner of the empire. They brought with them hundreds of cannons, including massive siege guns designed to smash stone walls to rubble. They also brought thousands of miners, whose job was to dig tunnels under the city's fortifications. On July 14, 1683, the main body of the Ottoman army arrived before the walls of Vienna. Kara Mustafa Pasha rode at the head of his troops. He established his headquarters on a hill overlooking the city. From there, he could survey his prize. He unfurled the great banners of the empire. The siege camp that sprang up was a city in itself. It was a sprawling maze of tents, pavilions, workshops. The Grand Vizier's own tent was a palace of silk and brocade, filled with luxuries from across the empire. He was so confident of victory that he had brought his entire court, his harem, with him. From the walls of Vienna, Count von Starhemberg and his small garrison watched this terrifying spectacle. They were now completely surrounded. They were cut off from the outside world. The Ottoman army numbered at least 150,000. The defenders were outnumbered by more than 10 to 1. As the sun set, the light glinted off a forest of steel. The sounds of the Ottoman camp, a low hum of thousands of voices, the hammering of workshops, carried across the fields. The storm had arrived. The siege of Vienna had begun. For the men, women, children inside the walls, a 2-month ordeal of fire, starvation, death was about to unfold. With the Ottoman army encamped around them, the Viennese prepared for the inevitable. Count von Starhemberg was in absolute command. He was a stern and unforgiving leader, but he was exactly what the city needed. His first order was to burn the city's own suburbs. This was a brutal, but necessary decision. The beautiful houses and gardens outside the walls would have provided perfect cover for the Ottoman attackers. The fires raged for days, creating a barren, blackened no-man's land around the fortifications. This would force the enemy to advance across open ground, under the fire of the city's cannons. Life inside the besieged city changed overnight. The normal rhythms of work and family were replaced by the constant demands of defense. Every able-bodied man was put to work. They repaired the walls, dug trenches, and hauled ammunition. The citizen militia trained alongside the professional soldiers. The class divisions of peacetime faded away in the face of a common threat. Women and children played a vital role too. They carried water, tended to the wounded, and helped to put out the fires caused by Ottoman shelling. The city became a single, unified organism, focused on one goal: survival. The psychological pressure was immense. The constant roar of Ottoman cannons became the soundtrack of daily life. The earth trembled as enemy miners dug their tunnels closer and closer to the walls. Sleep was a luxury. Fear was a constant companion. Starhemberg was everywhere, moving along the walls, encouraging his men, and overseeing the defense. He knew that the city's greatest enemy was not just the Ottoman army, but despair. He ordered that the city's musicians play from the top of St. Stephen's Cathedral, a defiant gesture to show the enemy that their spirit was not broken. Food and supplies were strictly rationed from the very beginning. Starhemberg knew this would be a long siege. The city had stockpiled grain and other foodstuffs, but it was not enough for a population of nearly 100,000 to last indefinitely. As the weeks dragged on, hunger began to bite. The price of bread skyrocketed. People were reduced to eating cats, dogs, and rats. Disease began to spread through the crowded cellars where people sheltered from the bombardment. Vienna was now an island, a last bastion of defiance in a sea of enemies. Its people were fighting not just for their city, but for their very lives. With the formalities of the ultimatum rejected, Kara Mustafa gave the order to begin the siege in earnest. He chose not to launch an immediate, all-out assault. This would have been too costly in lives. Instead, he opted for a more traditional and methodical approach. A formal siege, conducted according to the textbook principles of Ottoman military engineering. The first step was to dig a series of parallel trenches, known as saps, that would zigzag their way toward the city walls. This was the work of thousands of laborers. Specialized miners worked the picks and galleries. They were protected by the fire of their own infantry. On the evening of July 14th, the work began. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of Ottoman soldiers began digging. To the defenders on the walls, it sounded as if an army of moles was burrowing toward them. By morning, the first trench was complete, just out of range of the city's muskets. This trench would serve as the main base of operations for the siege. From here, the Ottomans could safely move troops, and move supplies. They would then begin digging the next trench, even closer to the walls. The inexorable, crawling advance toward the city's defenses had begun. At the same time, the Ottoman artillerymen began placing their cannons. They constructed large earthen batteries to protect the guns and their crews. They had brought hundreds of cannons with them, ranging from light field guns to massive siege mortars. These were state-of-the-art weapons, capable of hurling enormous stone or iron balls that could shatter stone walls. The placement of these batteries was a slow and deliberate process. The gunners wanted to find the weakest points in Vienna's fortifications. They focused their attention on the bastions protecting the imperial palace, the Leubel bastion, the Berg bastion. A few days into the siege, the Ottoman cannons opened fire. The bombardment was terrifying. The roar of the guns was continuous, a constant, deafening thunder that shook the entire city. Huge cannonballs smashed into the walls, sending stone and dust flying. Incendiary shells, designed to start fires, rained down on the houses inside the city. The people of Vienna huddled in their cellars, praying for deliverance. For the soldiers on the walls, it was the beginning of a living hell. They had to endure the constant shelling, while watching the enemy's trenches creep ever closer. The physical and psychological pressure was immense from the very first day. The siege of Vienna quickly evolved, fought not just on the walls, but deep within the earth beneath them. Kara Mustafa, confident in his engineers, had chosen siege warfare over a direct bloody assault. His main weapon was not the cannon, but the mine. Thousands of miners, men skilled in tunneling from across the Ottoman Empire, began to dig a complex network of tunnels, or saps, aiming at the foundations of the city's main bastions. Their goal: burrow underneath the stone walls, plant enormous caches of gunpowder, detonate them to create a catastrophic breach. This was slow, methodical, and terrifyingly effective. The Viennese defenders understood the subterranean threat and began desperate storm bunkermining, binding, hinsubwin, tanning, ombi, oppermind, arnderer. Suns. Soldiers and civilian volunteers, many former miners, dug out from the cellars, trying to locate Ottoman tunnels before they reached the walls. To detect vibrations, they used drums with dried peas on top, bowls of water, and close, listening for the faint, rhythmic pickaxe strikes. When two tunnels met, a desperate, savage fight ensued. Men fought with swords, daggers, pistols, and even their digging tools in chaotic hand-to-hand struggles. This little war was a constant, nerve-wracking feature of the siege. The psychological toll was immense. Defenders feared the ground erupting, miners feared being buried alive or killed. For weeks this silent, hidden battle raged. The fate of Vienna decided meter by meter beneath the fortifications. The main focus of the Ottoman attack was the defensive line, the Grand Leubel bastion, the Berg bastion. In front of this section stood a smaller triangular outwork, the Ravelin. This was the Berg Ravelin, a critical piece of the city's outer defenses. Its purpose: shield the main wall, shield the city gate from direct cannon fire, break up the flow of any infantry assault. For the Ottomans, capturing the Ravelin was the essential first step. For the defenders, holding it meant life or death. For weeks, the Berg Ravelin was the siege's epicenter. It was subjected to intense cannon bombardment and mortar bombardment. The structure was smashed, walls collapsed into stone and earth. Ottoman miners drove tunnels toward it, detonating mine after mine, creating breaches in its forward-facing walls. The small garrison lived in perpetual hell, enduring constant shelling from above. the terror of explosions from below, while repelling repeated infantry probes. The fighting was savage and unrelenting. Close quarters, muskets, grenades, swords, pikes, amid the ruins. Ottomans detonated a mine. As the dust settled, waves of janissaries swarmed forward, attempting to storm the breach. Viennese defenders, often outnumbered, met them in desperate hand-to-hand struggle. Control of the ravelin swung back and forth. The defenders would be pushed out. Then a furious counterattack to reclaim the ground. The earth of the ravelin became soaked with blood, littered with the dead and dying from both sides. This contest consumed thousands of lives. It was a meat grinder for elite Janissary regiments, and for Starhemberg's veteran soldiers. The Ravelin fight was a microcosm of the entire siege. Courage and endurance were pitted against overwhelming numbers, and against crushing firepower. As long as the defenders held the outwork, Vienna's main wall stayed safe. But each day, the Ravelin grew weaker, and the Ottoman attackers grew more determined to finally take it. As Vienna choked in a tightening ring of steel and fire, a different kind of battle was being waged across the rest of Europe. This was a battle of diplomacy, persuasion, and faith. From the Vatican in Rome, Pope Innocent XI worked tirelessly. He saw the siege of Vienna not merely as a Habsburg problem, but as an existential threat to all of Christendom. He understood that if Vienna fell, the road to Rome itself would be open. The Pope became the diplomatic heart of the resistance, using his moral authority and his considerable wealth to forge an alliance that seemed all but impossible just months before. He sent his papal nuncios, his ambassadors, to every major Catholic court in Europe. They carried with them urgent letters and, more importantly, large subsidies. The Pope offered vast sums of money to any prince willing to raise an army and march to Vienna's aid. He framed the conflict in stark religious terms. This was a holy war, a crusade to defend the faith against the forces of the infidel. He called for prayers in every church across the continent, creating a groundswell of public support and pressure on the reluctant rulers to act and defend their common heritage. The Pope's greatest challenge was the complex web of European rivalries. The most powerful Christian monarch, King Louis XIV of France, was the secret ally of the Ottomans. He saw the Habsburg Emperor as his main rival and was happy to see him weakened. The Protestant states of Northern Europe were deeply suspicious of a Catholic crusade led by the Pope and the Habsburg Emperor. They feared it was a plot to reassert Catholic dominance. The continent was a fractured mosaic of competing interests, historical grievances, and religious mistrust, a state of affairs Kara Mustafa had counted on. Despite these obstacles, the Pope's message of shared danger began to break through the walls of political cynicism. His financial support made it easier for indebted German princes to mobilize their armies. His moral pressure made it harder for them to refuse. Slowly, painstakingly, the diplomatic efforts began to bear fruit. The Holy League was fragile and temporary, but its success shows even bitter rivals can unite against an existential threat. The fate of the city now depended on whether these paper agreements and promises of gold could be turned into an actual army on the battlefield in time. The central figure in Europe's response was not an emperor, not a pope, but a king, John III Sobieski, king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a larger-than-life warrior king from a bygone age. At 64, he was already a living legend. He'd spent his adult life on Europe's brutal eastern frontiers, battling Cossacks, battling Tartars, battling the Ottomans, a brilliant military strategist, a charismatic leader, absolutely adored by his soldiers, known for leading charges from the front, fearless in battle. Not like the distant, court-bound monarchs of the West, deep, personal understanding of the Ottoman threat. He defeated them in a string of victories, most famously at the Battle of Khotin, 1673. That victory won him the Polish crown and Europe's respect. The Ottomans called him the Lion of Lekistan, the Lion of Poland. He knew Ottoman tactics, strengths, and weaknesses better than any Christian commander. He wasn't intimidated by numbers or reputation. That experience made him the indispensable leader for relief. His motivation, piety, honor, strategic calculation. As a devout Catholic, he felt duty to answer the Pope. He also had a rivalry with Louis XIV of France. He wanted to upstage Louis and lift his kingdom's prestige. Most importantly, pragmatism. He knew the Ottoman slogan, first Vienna, then Krakow. He was defending his own borders, confident, decisive, unshakable in his belief. While others hesitated, he acted with a soldier's clarity. He wrote to his wife, "This is a cause of God, and not of men." He poured his energy and prestige into uniting the Christian army. There was no other man in Europe who could have done it. With the Sejm's approval secured, the call to arms went out across the vast Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The corps of the army that Sobieski would lead was one of the most spectacular and formidable military units in the world, the Winged Hussars. These were the elite heavy cavalry of the kingdom, a force that had dominated Eastern European battlefields for over a century. They were not just soldiers, they were a brotherhood of the nobility, men who were born to fight and who saw warfare as the highest expression of their status and honor. Their reputation alone was a weapon. The appearance of the hussars was, honestly, designed to be terrifying. They were clad in gleaming plate armor, often worn over expensive silks and velvets. They wore the skins of leopards or tigers draped over their shoulders, but their most famous and distinctive feature was the wings, large wooden frames, adorned with eagle feathers, that were attached to the backs of their saddles. As they charged, the wind rushing through these feathers created a loud, unearthly rattling and humming sound, which was said to frighten enemy horses and demoralize enemy infantry. Their primary weapon was the kopia, a hollowed-out lance that was exceptionally long, sometimes up to 18 feet. It was longer than the pikes used by enemy infantry, allowing the hussars to strike their opponents before they could be struck themselves. This lance would shatter on impact, and the hussar would then draw his long saber, or zabla, to continue the fight in the ensuing melee. They charged in disciplined, tightly packed formations, building up immense momentum until they hit the enemy line like a human battering ram, a shock tactic that few armies could withstand. The mustering of the hussars and the rest of the Polish army was a slow process. The nobles had to return to their estates, gather their retainers, and equip themselves for war. From all corners of the sprawling kingdom, these elite warriors began their journey to the assembly point near Krakow. It was a river of steel and color, a medieval host gathering for a modern war. They were the ultimate weapon in Sobieski's arsenal. He knew that if he could get his hussars to the battlefield at Vienna, he had a force that could break any line and turn the tide of any battle. In mid-August, after finally securing the consent of his parliament, Jan Sobieski began his historic march. He left Krakow at the head of the Polish army, a force of around 25,000 men. The journey to Vienna was over 250 miles, an army with thousands of horses, and a long baggage train. The route took them south through the Carpathian mountain passes, across the plains of Moravia. It was a race against time. The march was arduous. The summer heat was oppressive. The roads were poor. They crossed numerous rivers and navigated difficult mountain passes. Logistics were a constant challenge. The army consumed vast amounts of food and fodder daily. Sobieski's quartermasters worked miracles to keep supplies moving. March discipline was strict. He needed the army fit for battle. Meanwhile, German contingents moved west to the Danube, the Bavarians under Max Emanuel, the Saxons under John George. The Imperial Army under Charles of Lorraine moved to Tulln, on the north bank of the Danube, about 20 miles upstream from Vienna. This was the designated meeting point, a massive, coordinated movement of 3 army groups. Commanders felt enormous psychological pressure. All of Europe was watching. They feared interception or a final, desperate assault on Vienna. The march was urgent. Scouts rode far ahead. Troops marched from dawn until dusk, pushing themselves to the very limit. The fate of Vienna was being measured in the miles they covered each day. As the sun rose on September 12, 1683, it illuminated a scene of breathtaking scale and tension. A light mist clung to the Danube Valley, shrouding the lower ground in a soft, ethereal haze. From the heights of the Kahlenberg, the commanders of the Holy League looked down upon a world poised on the brink of cataclysmic violence. Below them, the vast, sprawling city of the Ottoman camp was stirring, its thousands of cook fires sending thin plumes of smoke into the morning air. Beyond the camp lay the battered, smoking silhouette of Vienna, a city that had endured 60 days of hell and was now minutes away from either salvation or annihilation. The air was cool and still, pregnant with the anticipation of the storm about to break. The Allied army, numbering some 70,000 men, began its slow and deliberate advance at first light. The battle plan was simple in concept, but immensely difficult in execution. On the left flank, nearest the Danube, the imperial troops, under the overall command of Charles of Lorraine, were to begin the attack. the Saxon troops were to begin the attack. Their job was to engage the main strength of the Ottoman army, pinning it down in a brutal grinding battle of attrition. On the right, the Polish forces, under the direct command of King John Sobieski, would advance more slowly, waiting for the decisive moment. Other German contingents would advance more slowly, holding for the signal. The fate of the day depended on this coordinated movement. For the soldiers, this was a moment of supreme tension. They had marched for weeks, endured hardship, and were now about to face a feared and formidable enemy. The German infantrymen checked their muskets and tightened the ranks of their pike formations. The Polish cavalrymen adjusted their armor and whispered prayers, their hands resting on the hilts of their sabers. A wave of religious fervor, stoked by the priests who moved among the ranks, swept through the army. They were not just fighting for an emperor or a king, they were fighting for their faith. They were fighting for their homes. They were fighting for the very soul of their world. Down on the plain, Kara Mustafa Pasha finally awoke to the full extent of the danger he was in. The sight of the entire Allied army descending from the Vienna woods, a far larger and more organized force than he had anticipated, must have been a profound shock. Yet, his obsession with capturing Vienna remained. He made a fateful decision. Instead of turning his entire army to face this new threat, he kept his elite janissaries in the trenches, ordering them to prepare for one final massive assault on the city. He believed he could still smash his way into Vienna while a portion of his army held off the relief force. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The first shots of the Battle of Vienna were fired around 8 a.m. on the Allied left wing. The disciplined infantry columns of the Holy Roman Empire and the electorate of Saxony descended from the foothills and began their methodical advance across the broken terrain. Their objective was to seize the villages of Nussdorf, Heiligenstadt, which were strongly held by Ottoman forces. This was the German anvil, the solid, unyielding part of the Allied army whose task was to absorb the main Ottoman counterattack and grind down their numbers, creating the conditions for Sobieski's decisive blow later in the day. The battle for Vienna had begun not with a glorious charge, but with a hard, slogging infantry fight. The Ottoman forces in this sector, commanded by the Pasha of Buda, reacted swiftly. They were experienced troops, and they used the terrain to their advantage. The vineyards, walled gardens, and houses of the villages became a network of small fortresses. The fighting quickly became a brutal, close-quarters struggle. The German infantry had to clear the enemy from each position one by one, a bloody process that cost them heavily. The crackle of thousands of muskets filled the air, and the smoke of battle soon obscured the field, making command and control incredibly difficult for the officers on both sides. Duke Charles of Lorraine directed the attack with his characteristic caution and professionalism. He fed his battalions into the fight carefully, maintaining a strong reserve and ensuring his flanks were secure. This was not a battle for brilliant maneuvers, it was a battle of sheer willpower and firepower. The German regiments, with their superior discipline and drill, pushed forward relentlessly. They would fire a volley from their muskets, then advance under the cover of their long pikes, slowly but surely dislodging the stubborn Ottoman defenders from their positions. The advance was measured in yards, not miles, and every yard was paid for in blood. The Ottoman commanders, seeing the pressure on their left flank, began to move reinforcements from the center of their line to try and halt the German advance. This was exactly what the Allied plan intended. The fighting in the villages and vineyards became a vortex, sucking in more and more of the Ottoman army. Kara Mustafa, still focused on his planned assault on Vienna, was slow to appreciate the scale of the threat on his flank. He allowed his commanders to commit their troops piecemeal, weakening his overall position and playing directly into the hands of the Allied strategists. It was now around 5 in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the battlefield. The moment had arrived. King Jan Sobieski raised his saber high in the air. He was a commanding figure, his armor gleaming, his presence radiating an almost supernatural confidence.
He turned to his men, his voice ringing out across the assembled ranks of the Polish cavalry. According to legend, his order was simple and direct, a command that fused religious faith with military action. He cried out, "In the name of God, forward."
It was the trigger that unleashed the most devastating cavalry attack in history. In response to their king's command, a deep guttural roar rose from the throats of the 20,000 horsemen. It was a primal sound of aggression and commitment, a promise of the violence to come. The entire line of cavalry, stretching for over 2 miles, began to move as one. The advance started slowly, at a walk. The sheer spectacle of it was mesmerizing. a vast, glittering river of men and horses flowing down the long, gentle slope towards the disorganized Ottoman army. The ground began to tremble under the impact of 80,000 hooves. The age of knights and chivalry was about to have its final glorious moment. As they picked up speed, transitioning from a walk to a trot, the winged hussars lowered their massive lances. The forest of upright spears dipped down as one, becoming a terrifying hedge of steel points aimed directly at the heart of the enemy. The sound began to build. The rhythmic drumming of the hooves grew louder, accompanied by the jingling of harness and the rattling of armor. And then, a new sound was added, the one unique to the hussars. The unearthly hum and whistle of the wind rushing through the thousands of eagle feathers on their wings. The Ottoman troops on the plain below looked up in horror. They had just been driven back by the Allied infantry, and now they saw this apocalyptic vision descending upon them. A whole hillside was in motion, a wave of armored cavalry that seemed to cover the entire horizon. Their own cavalry, the Sipahis, tried to form up to meet the charge, but they were disorganized and outnumbered. The Ottoman infantry, exhausted and demoralized, began to panic. They knew they could not stand against such a force. Before the first blow had even been struck, the charge had already won a psychological victory. In the final few hundred yards, the trumpet sounded the final command, "Charge!" The riders spurred their horses into a full gallop. The controlled advance exploded into a headlong rush of unrestrained speed and violence. The winged hussars leaned forward over their horses' necks, their lances perfectly level, aimed at the chests of the enemy. Their speed was terrifying, a mass of over 1,000 tons of man and horse moving at over 30 miles an hour. They were a living battering ram, an unstoppable force about to meet a broken and demoralized object. For the Ottoman soldiers in their path, the final moments must have been an experience of pure terror. The thunder of the hooves was now overwhelming. The sight of the thousands of glittering lance points, the demonic feathered wings of the hussars. There was no time to run, no place to hide. Raise their shields, fire a last, desperate volley from their muskets, and brace for an impact that they knew would be utterly overwhelming. The final charge was about to make contact, and with it, seal the fate of the Ottoman army. The impact was cataclysmic. The first line of the charge, the Polish winged hussars, slammed into the wavering Ottoman formations with an irresistible force. The 18-foot lances, backed by the immense momentum of the charge, punched through everything in their path. Splintered shields, pierced armor, impaled soldiers lifting them from their saddles or flinging them to the ground. The initial shock was so powerful that the first Ottoman line simply ceased to exist. It did not break and run. It was annihilated, vaporized in a single violent instant. The hussars shattered their lances on the impact and then drew their long sabers, continuing the slaughter without breaking stride. Immediately behind the hussars came the rest of the 20,000 horsemen. The German cuirassiers, heavy cavalry in three-quarter plate armor, crashed into the flanks of the disorganized Ottoman infantry. Their heavy broadswords rose and fell, cutting down the terrified soldiers trying to flee the carnage. The Polish panzerny cavalry swept forward, their lighter armor giving them the speed to pursue and destroy the enemy's panicked cavalry. The entire Allied cavalry force poured through the gap created by the hussars, fanning out into the Ottoman camp and spreading destruction in all directions. The Ottoman army, which had fought so stubbornly all day, now fell apart completely. All semblance of order was lost. Units dissolved as soldiers threw down their weapons and ran for their lives. The Sipahi cavalry, the pride of the Ottoman army, were scattered and ridden down. The Janissaries, pulled from the trenches for a last-ditch defense, were swept away by the sheer force of the charge. It was no longer a battle, it was a rout on an epic scale. The charge acted like a massive psychological shockwave, shattering the morale of the entire army in minutes. The Allied infantry, which had been fighting its own hard battle all day, now advanced across the plain with little opposition. They moved forward to secure the ground won by the cavalry and to mop up the last remaining pockets of resistance. They found an army that had lost its will to fight. Many Ottoman soldiers simply surrendered, throwing themselves on the mercy of the advancing German foot soldiers and Polish foot soldiers. Others continued to flee eastward, hoping to escape the carnage and cross the small river that ran behind their camp. The psychological impact of the winged hussars cannot be overstated. Their terrifying appearance, the sound of their wings, and the unstoppable force of their charge seemed to be something more than human. For the exhausted and superstitious Ottoman soldiers, it must have felt as if they were being attacked by angels of death. This supernatural terror, combined with the physical shock of the charge, was what broke their spirits so completely. They were not just beaten, they were spiritually defeated, convinced that God had abandoned their cause and was fighting on the side of their enemies. As the sun began to set, the battlefield presented a scene of almost apocalyptic devastation. The ground was littered with the bodies of men, bodies of horses, abandoned weapons, and with the brightly colored banners of the Ottoman army. The once orderly camp was a scene of chaos, with tents being looted, overturned wagons and tents fleeing soldiers. The great Ottoman war machine, the terror of Christendom for centuries, had been broken and scattered to the winds. The final charge had not just won a battle, it had shattered an army and an empire's dream of conquest. As the Allied cavalry poured into the Ottoman camp and the infantry followed, they were met with a sight that astonished them. The camp was not the austere military base they expected. It was a city of incredible luxury and wealth. The tents of the senior pashas were opulent pavilions, draped in silk and brocade. They were stuffed with fine carpets, furniture, and silver tableware. Soldiers stumbled on chests overflowing with gold coins. They found precious jewels and lavishly decorated robes. The sheer amount of plunder was staggering. It was the accumulated wealth of an empire, brought to the field of battle in an act of supreme arrogance. This incredible wealth had a powerful and immediate effect on the Allied soldiers. After weeks of hard marching and a day of brutal fighting, the sight of such easily won riches was an irresistible temptation. Discipline began to break down. Instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, many soldiers stopped to loot, especially the Cossack mercenaries and German mercenaries. They ransacked the tents, gathering silks, coffee, spices, and weapons. This looting, while understandable, was a dangerous moment. It slowed the pursuit and allowed thousands of Ottoman soldiers to escape, including the Grand Vizier himself. Among the incredible discoveries were things that would change European culture. Huge sacks of a strange dark bean, coffee. Legend says the hero messenger Jerzy Kulczycki was granted those sacks as his reward, and he used them to open the very first coffee house in Vienna. The Allies also found exotic animals, camels, ostriches, and strange musical instruments that would influence European bands. The camp was a treasure trove of the Ottoman world. The most important prize, however, was symbolic. In the chaos, the Grand Vizier had been forced to abandon the sacred banner of the Prophet Muhammad. The capture of this holy relic devastated Ottoman morale. It was a huge triumph for the Allies, a sign that God had favored their cause. The banner was presented to King Sobieski, who then sent it to the Pope in Rome as a testament to the Holy League's victory. The chaos in the camp had yielded not just material wealth, but the most powerful symbol of their enemy's defeat. In the midst of the chaos, as his army disintegrated around him, Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha made a desperate bid to escape. When the great cavalry charge shattered his lines, he was nearly captured. He was forced to fight his way out of his own headquarters, protected only by a small retinue of his personal bodyguards. He abandoned everything: his luxurious tents, his treasury, his court, and even his harem. His only thought was to save his own life. The man who had dreamed of riding into Vienna as a conqueror was now fleeing in terror from the battlefield. He tried in vain to rally his fleeing troops. He rode among them, shouting and pleading, but no one would listen. The panic was just too complete. His authority had evaporated in the face of the catastrophic defeat. Seeing that the situation was hopeless, he joined the stream of fugitives heading east, riding for the safety of the Ottoman-held territory in Hungary. He managed to escape the battlefield, but he could not escape the consequences of his failure. He had lost not only a battle, but one of the largest and most expensive armies the Ottoman Empire had ever fielded. His flight was a disgrace. He had abandoned not only the sacred banner of the Prophet, a crime for which there could be no forgiveness. As he retreated, his anger and shame boiled over into acts of cruelty. He blamed his subordinate commanders for the defeat, and had several of them executed on the road to Belgrade. He was trying to find scapegoats for his own catastrophic mistakes, his underestimation of the enemy, his fatal fixation on Vienna, and his failure to properly guard his rear. But no one was fooled. The responsibility for the disaster was his and his alone. The news of the defeat and the Grand Vizier's flight reached Constantinople, where it was met with disbelief and then fury. Sultan Mehmed IV, who had authorized the campaign, was enraged by the humiliation. The law of the Ottoman Empire was clear. A Grand Vizier who led a holy war and lost, especially one who lost the sacred banner, could expect only one punishment: On Christmas Day, 1683, agents of the Sultan arrived in Belgrade. They presented Kara Mustafa with a silk cord, the traditional instrument of execution for high-ranking officials. His dream of glory had ended in strangulation and disgrace in a dark room far from home. As darkness fell on the 12th of September, the battle was over. The Ottoman army was gone, a scattered and broken remnant fleeing into the night. King John Sobieski, at the head of his victorious troops, rode slowly towards the city they had saved. He did not enter Vienna that night. Instead, he made his camp in the captured tent of the Grand Vizier, a symbolic act of triumph. The city he had rescued was still a place of death and disease, and he wisely chose to keep his army outside its walls to prevent the spread of sickness. The next morning, the gates of Vienna were thrown open. The surviving defenders, skeletal figures in rags, emerged to greet their saviors. It was a moment of profound and overwhelming emotion. The rescuers looked in horror at the state of the city and its people. The Viennese looked at the soldiers of the Holy League as if they were angels sent from heaven. Count von Starhemberg, pale and weak from his wounds and sickness, came out to formally meet King Sobieski. The two men embraced, a simple gesture that symbolized the unity of the defenders and the rescuers. Sobieski and the other Allied commanders then entered the city. They went directly to St. Stephen's Cathedral for a service of thanksgiving. The great church was damaged, but still standing, a symbol of the city's resilience. The king, a deeply pious man, fell to his knees in prayer. He refused to take credit for the victory, famously paraphrasing Julius Caesar in a letter to the Pope, Veni, Vidi, Deus vicit. I came, I saw, God conquered. The liberation of Vienna was seen by all as a miracle, a direct intervention by God on behalf of Christendom. For the people of Vienna, the ordeal was over, but the recovery was just beginning. The city was in ruins. Thousands of its citizens were dead from combat, starvation, disease. The task of rebuilding would take years. But they had survived. They had withstood the might of a great empire for 2 months, and their defiance had made the great victory possible. The liberation was not just the end of a battle, it was the end of a nightmare. The city had been pushed to the very brink of annihilation, but it had held on, and now it was free. The victory at Vienna was more than just the lifting of a siege. It was, honestly, a pivotal moment in the history of Europe. The battle marked the high watermark of Ottoman expansion into the continent. Never again would an Ottoman army seriously threaten the heart of Christian Europe. The seemingly unstoppable wave of conquest that had begun centuries before had finally been broken on the plains outside Vienna. The long shadow of the crescent moon, which had hung over Eastern and Central Europe for so long, began to recede, and it would never return with the same terrifying power. The aftermath of the battle saw a dramatic shift in the balance of power. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered forever. The victory galvanized the Christian powers of Europe, who formed a new, more permanent Holy League to take the war to the Ottomans. In the years that followed, the Habsburg armies, led by brilliant commanders like Charles of Lorraine and Eugene of Savoy, would go on the offensive. They were no longer fighting to defend their own territory. They were fighting to reclaim lands that had been under Ottoman rule for over 150 years. In a series of stunning campaigns, they reconquered the entirety of Hungary, capturing the great fortress of Buda in 1686. They pushed deep into the Balkans, liberating vast territories in what is now Croatia, Serbia, Romania. The Great Turkish War, which began at Vienna, would end with the Ottoman Empire being permanently driven out of Central Europe. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699, a landmark peace settlement that formalized the new reality. For the first time in its history, the Ottoman Empire was forced to formally cede large swathes of its European territory to a victorious Christian coalition. It was a humiliating admission of defeat, and a clear signal of the empire's decline. The Habsburgs emerged as the dominant power in Central and Southeastern Europe. Their empire reinvigorated and expanded. Vienna, once a threatened frontier outpost, was now the secure heart of a burgeoning great power, free to blossom into the cultural metropolis of the 18th century. From the ashes of Vienna, the Ottoman dream of conquest burned out. The empire entered a long period of military stagnation and slow decline, becoming known as the sick man of Europe. The charge of the winged hussars on September 12, 1683, was the thunderous climax of this world-changing event. It was a moment when history itself seemed to accelerate, when the courage and actions of a few thousand men on a single afternoon altered the destiny of a continent. The Battle of Vienna was a turning point, a brutal and bloody clash of civilizations that marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was the day Europe, divided and fractious, finally fought back and, against all odds, won. Subscribe for more cinematic history.